Hello. So today our read aloud is about Harriet Tubman. Many of us have heard of Harriet Tubman before and have heard books about her life. She is such an amazing person, someone with tremendous courage who not only escaped from slavery, but helped many others escape as well. So every year we make sure and read something about her. I was looking through, and there's so many books about Harriet Tubman, and finding that there's actually some chapter books, and so maybe next year we will dive into that chapter book. But for today, have a book written by Christine Platt, who was the same person who wrote our book on Martin Luther King Jr. when we had that Padlet. So you'll notice it's kind of the illustrations. The illustrations are also done by the same illustrator, I believe. Wait, Laura. Oh, maybe they're different. Okay, but you'll notice it's the same kind of style. So without further ado, Story of Harriet Tubman, a biography book by Christine Platt, illustrated by Lara. It says, for Harriet's sister, Rachel Ross, and her children, Ben and Angerine. Chapter 1, A Leader is Born. Meet Harriet Tubman. Araminta Ross wasn't the type of child people imagined would grow up to become a leader. In fact, Araminta was born with many odds against her. Surprisingly, her biggest challenge would be the reason she became known as the brave leader, Harriet Tubman. That's because she was born into a life of slavery. Araminta's journey to become Harriet Tubman wasn't easy. Her entire family was enslaved. As a child, she saw her parents and siblings struggle as they worked on a plantation. A plantation is a big farm. Because Araminta's family members were slaves, they didn't receive pay for the hard work they were forced to do. When Araminta was just 5 years old, she was forced to work as well. As Araminta grew older, she became determined to free herself and her family from slavery forever. On her journey in search of freedom, Araminta grew from a young slave girl into the courageous woman, Harriet Tubman. Harriet spent much of her life helping other enslaved people gain their freedom as well. She put herself in danger countless times to help others. Harriet even served as a spy during the American Civil War. When Harriet became known for her brave acts, she used her fame to help even more people. So how did Harriet's amazing story begin? Harriet's America. Around 1822, so 200 years ago almost, Harriet Greene and Benjamin Ross had their fifth child, a daughter named Araminta Ross, who would grow up to become known as the hero Harriet Tubman. Historians believe Araminta was born on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. The exact date and location of her birth isn't known because she was born enslaved. Those kind of records were not kept when slaves were born. Araminta was often called by her nickname, Minty. She was one of the many descendants of African people who were captured and sold into slavery in the Americas, the Caribbean, and many British colonies. Enslaved people were considered property. The Brodus family owned Minty's parents, which meant they also owned Minty. Because Minty's parents were enslaved, they couldn't afford to buy her presents, but Minty's father was a good carpenter, and he made a wooden cradle for his newborn daughter. American slavery. Slavery was a system in which some people were forced to work on plantations harvesting crops. Other enslaved people were forced to cook, clean, and take care of their owners' homes and children. In America, white people of European ancestry mainly used Black people of African ancestry as slave labor. Enslaved Black people were considered property and were often treated very poorly. Enslaved people were not paid for their work, and slave owners often sold them to other plantations, which separated families. By 1804, the northern states had ended slavery, so most enslaved people worked on plantations in the South. So there were there was slavery that happened in the North. We really just kind of focus on the slavery that happened in the South, but it was all over the United States. Okay. Many people tried to escape, but those slaves who were captured and returned to their slave owners were badly punished, sometimes even killed. Minty's mother was one of the Brodus family's house slaves. She had to cook their meals. Minty's father was a woodworker on the plantation. He was often forced to do woodwork for neighbors too. Myth versus fact. The myth that Black people willingly came to America to work as slaves. Not true. The fact is, they were captured in Africa and sold into slavery. Over time, very few people of African ancestry knew their true origins. Those who did had no way to return. America was the only home they'd ever known. So some people like to propagate this myth that, oh, Black people willingly came here to be slaves in America. We know that that's not true. Enslaved people's lives were very difficult. Forced to work long hours, they were punished if they did not do what their owners demanded. Many slave owners were very cruel. They used whips and canes to beat their slaves. So most slaves did as they were told out of fear. They were afraid of what would happen to them if they disobeyed or tried to escape to the North. Before Minty was 5 years old, she did not have to work as a slave. Still, she saw the long hours her parents, siblings, and other enslaved people worked. Minty also saw her loved ones and other people being mistreated. As she grew older, Minty was determined not to spend her entire life in slavery. So when in 1619, so a little bit of history, in 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, up north, the Northeast. In 1776, American colonies declare independence from Britain, the Revolutionary War. Before 1790, Harriet's grandmother is sold into slavery in Maryland, and in 1804, last northern state abolishes slavery, but it continues in the South until the Civil War. Around 1822, Araminta Minty Ross is born. So that's kind of the timeline leading up to her birth. Chapter 2, the early years. Growing up in slavery. Enslaved people who were forced to harvest crops were known as field slaves. Field slaves had to work outside for hours in the hot sun. Enslaved people who worked in a home were known as house slaves. Their work wasn't easy, but it was considered better than working in the fields. Minty's mother hoped Mr. Brodus would make her daughter a house slave. She didn't want Minty to have a difficult life in the field. But even though Minty was her daughter, Minty was considered the property of the Brodus family. Mr. Brodus would decide Minty's fate. Minty didn't go to school. It was considered a crime for enslaved people to learn how to read or write. But like many slaves, Minty's parents memorized the Bible stories told at church. Minty loved it when her mother told her Bible stories. Minty devoted her life to serving God as a young girl. Soon she could recite Bible stories and long scriptures by memory. As Minty grew older, her father taught her about nature by taking her outside. So this is their family tree. So she's here, born to Benjamin Ross and Harriet Green. Here she is, Araminta Minty Ross. Her grandmother, Modesty. Minty learned about many types of trees and plants. Minty loved it most when she and her father went outside at night. Together, they'd look up at the night sky as Minty's father explained the starry patterns. He was the first person to tell Minty about the North Star, the brightest star in the sky. He told her that people who wanted to escape slavery followed the North Star to freedom. This is where they're living, down here, the Brodus Plantation in Maryland. Myth versus fact. So the myth that only enslaved adults were forced to work on plantations. Not true. The fact is, children as young as 5 years old were also used as slave labor. Put to work. Minty was 5 or 6 years old when Mr. Brodus decided it was time for her first job. He sent her to work for the Cook family. She would check their muskrat traps. The Cooks were mean. Whenever they thought Minty wasn't doing a good job, they beat her. Once Minty caught the measles and became very ill, but the Cooks thought Minty was just being lazy, and they told Mr. Brodus they no longer wanted her to work for them. Next, Mr. Brodus sent Minty to work for his neighbor, Miss Susan. She was a new mother and used Minty as a babysitter. Minty watched, changed, and fed Miss Susan's baby, but Miss Susan never wanted to hear her baby crying. It was an impossible task. All babies cry. Whenever Miss Susan heard the baby fussing, Minty was punished. So jump into the think tank. How would you feel if you were sent away from your family to work for strangers every day? That was what her life was like. And here she is, trying to keep the baby quiet. Minty didn't like how Miss Susan treated her, but she thought her home was lovely. Minty liked to go from room to room and look at Miss Susan's fancy things. One day, Minty saw sugar cubes in the kitchen. She took one. It was a big mistake. Miss Susan was watching her. Enslaved people who were caught stealing when something as small as a sugar cube were punished. When Minty realized Miss Susan had seen her, she ran and hid inside a pig pen where no one could find her. But Minty knew she couldn't hide forever. After 5 days, she returned to face her punishment and was beaten so badly that she almost died. When Minty got better, Mr. Brodess sent her to work in the fields. So when around 1822, we know that our Minty Ross is born. About 1827, she begins working as a slave. All right, chapter 3, no longer a child. Hard work. Minty quickly discovered that being a field slave was much harder than checking the cook's muskrat traps and babysitting for Miss Susan. Every day, Minty worked in the hot sun. Mr. Brodess hired an overseer to watch field slaves harvesting crops. That was basically someone, essentially a spy, just sent to watch all the slaves and report if anybody wasn't working hard enough or if people were talking to each other. If the overseer saw Minty or anyone else resting or working too slowly, he would punish them. Harvesting tobacco was hard work for Minty. Minty did as she was told so the overseer wouldn't think she was being lazy. She hated watching the overseer beat other people for working too slowly. Being in the field made Minty long for her freedom even more. In the summer of 1831, Minty learned that an enslaved man named Nat Turner tried to escape from a plantation in Virginia. Maryland slave owners like the Brodesses were worried because Nat didn't just run away, he started a rebellion. After Nat killed his owner and freed himself, he freed other enslaved people on the plantation. Then Nat asked for their help to free as many enslaved people as possible. Together, they went to other plantations, killed dozens of white slave owners, and freed more people. Eventually, Nat and those who helped him were captured, but after such a deadly rebellion, many slave owners feared the same thing would happen on their plantations. So a rebellion, an uprising. So there's a picture of Nat Turner. Minty knew she could never kill Mr. Brodess, but she was curious about another way she'd heard people escape slavery, the Underground Railroad. As Minty grew older, she continued to dream of freedom for herself and other enslaved people. When Minty was around 12 years old, a slave tried to escape the Brodesses' plantation and was captured. While he was being punished, Minty tried to protect him. Sadly, Minty was struck in the head with such force that she almost died. So again, a second time that she almost died. Myth, the Underground Railroad was a train system. No. The fact is, it was a secret route of safe places to help enslaved people escape to the North and Canada. The homes, barns, and churches on the Underground Railroad were owned by freed Black people and white people who disagreed with slavery. So it's just places, because if you're traveling across multiple states, hundreds and hundreds of miles, you're going to need safe places to stop and sleep and get food. So it was a route for people to go and get help as they were moving to the North. Minty's wounds eventually healed, but she wasn't the same as before. She had terrible sleeping spells that caused her to pass out without warning. Because Minty could no longer work in the fields, Mr. Brodess gave her different tasks to do around the plantation, but she still wasn't free. Strong mind. Minty believed her sleeping spells made her mind stronger than it was before her injury, and that God now spoke to her through her dreams. In my dreams and visions, I seemed to see a line, and on the other side of that line were green fields and lovely flowers. Minty often dreamed she was talking to angels about escaping slavery. Soon, Minty would need her strong mind to do important work for her people. So August 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion takes place in Virginia. So she's about 9 years old when this happens. Around 1834, Minty is injured trying to protect another slave. So she's only about 12 during that time. Chapter 4, Freedom is Calling. From Minty to Harriet Tubman. So when Minty was a young woman, she changed her name. She thought Minty sounded too childlike for someone who'd survived so much. She renamed herself Harriet in honor of her mother. When Harriet was hired out to chop timber for a shipyard owner named John Stewart around 1840, she worked extra hard. Sometimes Mr. Stewart had money left over and he'd pay Mr. Brodess for Harriet's work. Whenever he gave Harriet the extra money, she saved it. When the time came for Harriet to escape, she knew she would need it. In 1844, Harriet met John Tubman, a free black man. He asked Harriet to marry him. Even though John was free, he didn't have the same rights and privileges as white men. Harriet would be his wife, and she would still be considered the property of Mr. Brodess. If John and Harriet had children, their children would become the property of Mr. Brodess as well. So, how would you feel if your loved one was someone else's property, considered someone else's property, belonging to someone else? There's a drawing of Harriet and John Tubman. Despite these challenges, Harriet agreed to marry John. When Harriet was around 25 years old, she became Mrs. Harriet Tubman. She sewed a beautiful quilt to honor their union. Harriet continued to dream about escaping slavery. One day, Harriet told John about her visions. Rather than support her, John said he would turn her in if she tried to escape. Harriet never spoke to him about her dreams again. Escape to freedom. In 1849, Harriet heard that Mr. Brodess planned to sell some of his slaves and send them farther south, where slavery was much worse. Harriet was terrified. She prayed that Mr. Brodess would change his mind. I prayed all night long for my master till the 1st of March. So these are quotes by Harriet. Mr. Brodess didn't change his mind, so Harriet changed her prayer. Oh Lord, if you ain't never going to change that man's heart, kill him, Lord, and take him out of the way. When Mr. Brodess died a week later, Harriet felt guilty and afraid. No one knew what would happen next. Harriet's sisters, Lena, Soph, and Mariah, had been sold a few years before. Harriet didn't want that to happen to her brothers, Henry and Ben. She came up with a plan to use the Underground Railroad to escape. On September 17, 1849, Harriet, Ben, and Henry fled into the night. Harriet was excited to finally start the journey north, just as she'd always dreamed, but along the way, Henry and Ben became afraid. Harriet tried to convince them to continue their trip, but they decided to return to the Brodess' Poplar Neck plantation. Harriet went with them to make sure they got back safely. But Harriet didn't stay for long. 2 days later, she gathered her money, a small amount of food, and her wedding quilt. She escaped alone. Just as her father had taught her, Harriet followed the North Star as her guide. So she went here from Maryland up to Pennsylvania. Some people were willing to help anyone trying to escape slavery. These people left items like lit lanterns outside their homes along the secret route of the Underground Railroad. Harriet saw one of these lanterns outside the home of a Quaker woman who let Harriet come inside and rest. She then told Harriet how to get to the next safe house. Harriet was so grateful that she gave the woman her wedding quilt in thanks. Myth: running away was an easy way to escape. Fact: it was very dangerous. Many people who ran away returned out of fear. Over several days, many other kind and brave people helped Harriet travel north. After she walked nearly 90 miles, she finally crossed the border into Pennsylvania. Harriet was free. She promised to one day return to Poplar Neck to free her family as well. So around 1840, Harriet began working to chop timber for John Stewart. 1844, she marries John Tubman. 1849, she runs away from Poplar Neck Plantation. Okay, we'll read one more chapter together and then we'll pause. Chapter 5, Liberty for All, an underground conductor. From the moment she crossed into Pennsylvania, Harriet loved the feeling of freedom. She said, "When I found I'd crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." With the help of the Pennsylvania Vigilance Committee, Harriet went to Philadelphia. The committee helped people who escaped slavery find jobs and keep in touch with their family members who were still enslaved. Its chairman, Mr. William Still, helped Harriet find work as a maid. Harriet saved every dollar she earned. She planned to use the money to rescue her family. One day, Harriet found out that her niece, Keziah, had her 2 children, James and Araminta, were about to be sold. Harriet returned to Maryland. She hid in a safe house until Keziah and her children could meet her. Then Harriet used the Underground Railroad to lead them all to freedom. For Harriet, it was the first of many trips. Moses of her people. Harriet continued to travel to help free more of her family members and close friends. Then Congress passed a law that made Harriet's work even more dangerous. We can see here there's a wanted sign, dead or alive, Harriet Moses Tubman, reward $40,000. It's a lot of money today, but back then, it's a lot of money. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 said people who escaped slavery and who were found in the North could be returned to their former owners in the South. Anyone who helped people escape slavery could be jailed, fined, or worse. Slave owners heard about Harriet and offered large rewards for anyone who captured her. Even though she had to be more careful now, Harriet continued to risk her life to free people. She wore disguises, and she often dressed and acted like an old woman to appear harmless. Harriet helped so many people escape that her nickname was Moses, like the man in the Bible who led his people to freedom. Harriet asked her husband to join her in Philadelphia. She knew his life would be better if he lived in a free state, but Harriet learned that John had already married another woman. Harriet continued her work and acted like a conductor for the Underground Railroad. She had one rule. Any person who joined her on the trip north could not turn back. Because of this rule, Harriet never lost a single passenger. Because people who escaped slavery and who were caught in the North could be returned to their slave owners in the South, Harriet started taking people all the way to Canada. Slavery was no longer legal in Canada, and that country had no fugitive slave law. Many former slaves started a community in St. Catharines, Ontario. Harriet helped many people, including her elderly parents and brothers, escape to St. Catharines. So, most slaves who escaped to freedom never returned to the South because it was so dangerous. Harriet was very brave. Do you think you could have been as brave? So, just a think tank question. Okay, so now she's going all the way up from Maryland through the state of Pennsylvania, all the way over here to Ontario, Canada. A lot farther than just boop, where she stopped here in Pennsylvania. She had to travel a whole way across the state and up into Canada. Harriet had fulfilled her promise to free her loved ones and others from the horrors of slavery. So in 1849, Harriet escapes using the Underground Railroad. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Laws passed. 1851, Harriet begins leading slaves to freedom in Canada. All right, so we're going to pause there and hear the rest of her prolific story next week. And next week, we'll also have a read aloud about a slave who used the Underground Railroad to escape enslavement by using also a box to travel in. So have a great day. I'll see you later.